British Member of Parliament Nusrat Ghani said that her Conservative Party fired her from a ministerial position because she is Muslim. And now a survey has come out that British middle classes and upper classes have more Islamophobia than the working people. And there is a survey report out there. It's called the Dinner Table Prejudice, Islamophobia in Contemporary Britain. And we have the co-author of this particular report, Stephen Jones. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you for having me.
Stephen Jones is a sociologist of religion with focus on Muslims in UK at the University of Birmingham. So were you surprised with the findings of your survey that 26% British view Muslims negatively?
In truth, not entirely surprised by that. I've been researching Islam in the UK for many, many years now, and I've been looking at Muslim communities and responses to Muslim communities. And there's a fairly consistent stream of negativity when it comes to the way that Muslims are represented in the media, in our political class. The case of Nusrat Ghani kind of exemplifies, if you will, the way in which Muslims have been treated in politics over the years too. So it's not a huge surprise. The interesting thing was the way in which those kind of negative perceptions played out. So some of the ways in which, on certain questions at least, the negativity seems to be more concentrated amongst the upper middle classes rather than those who are working class, who are traditionally, in our political discourse at least, associated more strongly with anti-migration views and sort of intolerant views.
One of the questions which you ask in your survey is about the Sharia No Go Zones. Now, is that particular phrase is so well established that when you asked that question, everybody knew what you were asking about?
Yes and no, I think is the answer to that. So yes, in the sense that there has been for some time now, for some years, a kind of narrative in the right-wing press, in particular in the UK, and to some extent in the United States as well, about the UK, I should say, not about the United States, about the idea that certain parts of the UK, Muslim majority areas, such as small towns in the north like Blackburn, or places like Bolton, for example, or certain subsections of places where I work in Birmingham, are in effect kind of regulated informally by Sharia law. And this is something of a myth. There are sort of Sharia councils that do things like administer Islamic divorces informally, but there's nothing like the kind of claims that they're making. But those claims have been very, very widely repeated in the right-wing press, particularly our sort of centre-right publication, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the sort of right-wing tabloids that we have in the UK. So it's something that's quite a common trope. At the same time, we do interview people about the questions we use in surveys, and we did find a certain amount of confusion. So it's a mixture of sort of hardcore conspiracy theory about Muslims in the UK wanting to sort of overturn British laws, and a mixture of that with just fairly simple confusions about the nature of British Muslim communities.
Tell us this, is the working class people have less prejudice because they are more connected with the Muslim community who might be more working class?
I mean, that is one thing that's been hypothesized, if you will. I don't think it's quite that simple. It depends on the question we asked. So when we asked people, we asked various questions, not just about Islam and Muslims. We asked questions also about different ethnic groups. So the largest ethnic minority, South Asian ethnic minority, come from Pakistan in the UK. So we included questions about that minority. Of course, there's a huge overlap between Muslims and Pakistani heritage migrants in the UK, but also around Jewish people, Sikh people, and so on. And what was interesting is when we asked questions about things like banning migration to the UK from Muslims or from other religious or ethnic groups, it tended to be the working class people who would respond in a significantly higher proportion that they supported those kinds of bans. However, when we start to turn to questions about religion and religious prejudice, so we had one question in particular that sought to analyze whether people felt that the Islam was a religion that was inherently literalistic, a kind of inherently fundamentalist religion, in contrast to other religions, which are much more kind of rational and free thinking, if you will. Then in those questions, that's where the sort of middle class prejudice seemed to come into being and sort of into fruition in larger numbers. So that's where we really sort of saw the middle class prejudice around those religious questions.
Now, one of the things surprising, which most people in the United States might not have an idea about, is that there was more prejudice found when it comes to gypsies and Irish travelers. First, describe to us what is Irish travelers.
Okay, so we use the phrase if you're talking in policy circles, people who are expert in these kinds of issues, they use the abbreviation GRT communities, meaning Gypsy, Roma, and Irish traveller communities. So these are, broadly speaking, groups of people who have had no sort of fixed abode, as it were, will tend to move between sites. And we have a system in the UK where traveller communities have distinct sites where they can stay and move between. The heritage of those two particular communities tends to be either Roma, that's more the case across the rest of Europe than it is Romani communities, which is more the case across the rest of Europe rather than the UK. In the UK, many of the traveller community members trace their heritage back to Ireland, so they tend to be referred to sort of colloquially as Irish travellers, and they're one of the groups that again gets much higher levels of negativity and prejudice than most other communities.
Why?
Oh, it's a good question. I think it's because of a variety of factors. I mean, historically, Roma populations have been heavily persecuted across Europe, and there's part of that in the UK too. The Roma, of course, were one of the, alongside Jewish people, one of the populations that were executed in the course of the Holocaust. So it's a long-standing historical prejudice. But there are also contemporary issues too, where precisely because they are an itinerant population that moves between places, there tends to be significant sites of struggle about where they locate. So I live, although I work in Birmingham, I live slightly outside the city, in a more rural part of the UK. And in more rural parts of the UK, where there will be traveller sites located, there are often stereotypes about criminality, for example, and it's often fierce opposition to the formal creation of Irish traveller sites, precisely because of those kinds of stereotypes.
You know, Muslims remain in the news because of war on terrorism. Why gypsies and what you refer to as Irish travellers remain in the news?
It's a very good question, actually, because in truth, there's less media coverage of traveller communities than there is of Muslims in the UK. This is one of the reasons why the findings around traveller communities were somewhat surprising to me. If I'm honest, I'm not an expert in that community as I am in Islam and Muslim communities. That said, though there's been a sort of steady repetition post 9/11 in the UK, as in many countries, of negative stories about Muslims, there are certainly significant negative representations of traveller communities as well. So they're the two communities. The way I've tried to phrase it in the work we've done around this particular report and survey is to say they're not the only communities that are discriminated against. We have heavy discrimination against Black populations in the UK, for example, but they are the two communities where it is, in a sense, publicly acceptable to acknowledge that even to some extent, the discrimination might be a good thing or might be tolerated or might be worth supporting in public arenas. You will find people questioning the concept of Islamophobia, for example, and in the same way, you will find people in the UK press, sometimes in political life, but less so, suggesting that actually some of the stereotypes and prejudices that I mentioned towards traveller communities are in fact justified.
Stephen, you being a sociologist, what side you tilt on? Is Islamophobia a racist attitude, or is it a religious prejudice?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think that's one of the core things that when I designed this survey, that's one of the things that I wanted to try and pick apart, if you will. So in the United Kingdom, we have a fairly fierce debate going on about the definition of Islamophobia and whether the particular definitions of Islamophobia should be recognised formally by government, by different political parties, by councils, that's local and municipal government, and by different non-governmental organisations as well. So what's happened more recently is that those definitions have tended to emphasise the idea that Islamophobia is a form of racism. Now, I am not against that idea. I think it's fairly persuasively argued. Islam is a religion that in different countries has been racialized. In the UK, it tends to be conflated with being of South Asian heritage, so Indian, Pakistani, or Bangladeshi. At the same time, Islamophobia is a long-standing phenomenon that is intertwined with the emergence of modern racism. So I don't have an argument against necessarily the idea that Islamophobia is akin to a kind of racism. But what I was trying to do is highlight the way in which that at the same time it can be a form of racism. There are distinct stereotypes about Islam as a religious tradition, as a tradition that is sort of closed-minded or is fundamentally opposed to rational thinking, those kinds of things. And those are the kind of stereotypes we tended to find more widely represented amongst those who are upper and middle class, as we were saying.
Share with us, your report. How has been its coverage in the British media?
So far, so good. Actually, it's been pretty widely covered, in part because of the case of Nusrat Ghani and the fact that emerged at the same time as we were releasing the report. It's been covered quite widely in the media, mainly in the liberal press. So our major liberal publication is The Guardian, which has some readership in the United States as well. So in there, but also within what we call Sky News. So that's the Rupert Murdoch partially owned, at least, news network, which is not. We have slightly stronger media regulation for broadcast media in the UK than we do in the US. So it's a bit harder to define news networks as being right-leaning or leftward-leaning, conservative or progressive. But at the same time, it tends to attract viewers who are not necessarily just to the progressive end of the political spectrum. So it's been quite positive, the coverage so far, and it's been fairly widely recognised. It hasn't been covered quite so much in the right-wing tabloid press, the Mail and the Express that I mentioned earlier, but we've had some good coverage across the board.
Nusrat Ghani case came out, she spoke, and Warsi has spoken before. So do you think Conservative Party really will care to address these type of issues, or they think it is advantageous for them to raise these type of issues to solidify their vote bank?
It's a very good question. It's an internal debate that's been going on for some time within the Conservative Party itself, and it's quite a difficult issue for them simply in strategic terms in some ways, because there are commentators within the Conservative Party and members of the Conservative Party who have pointed out quite rightly that the British Muslim public is quite conservative socially, much more conservative socially than the mainstream British population. So there have been people saying that actually the British Muslim population, which is around 5-6% of the UK population as a whole now, is potentially a good sort of basis of votes for the Conservatives that they've been missing out on. Because I think around, if my memory serves me correctly, going on for 70-80% of British Muslims when they vote for Labour, which is the centre-left party. So there has been that debate. But at the same time, the difficulty that the Conservative Party has is that they can't easily give due recognition to Islamophobia and these cases like Nusrat Ghani, simply because to acknowledge a definition of Islamophobia and to pass as it were, sort of to measure various conservative politicians against a meaningful definition of Islamophobia would mean that quite a few of those individuals would end up facing some kind of disciplinary action or have to make some kind of apology. To give a couple of examples, Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister, has said very colourful things about British Muslims, which did not go down at all when amongst the Muslim public. Arguably worse, his predecessor, one of his predecessors, David Cameron, he said things, so under the cover of what we call parliamentary privilege, one cannot be sued for libel if you say something in Parliament. But he basically accused an Imam living in London of being a sympathiser for terrorism in the course of an attempt to derail the election of Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. And one of his colleagues, the current the defence minister at the time, I should say, said similar things outside of Parliament and was sued successfully for defamation. So there have been clear cases where conservative politicians have been successfully sued for libel because of anti-Muslim slurs. And so if that's the case, if you start investigating cases seriously of Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, it could easily end up with various different politicians being either disciplined and potentially just removed from the party altogether. So partly because our current political leadership in the Conservative Party is somewhat resistant to the idea of sort of coming clean. There are currently many scandals in the UK around Conservative Party abiding by COVID regulations. And the tendency has just been to try and sort of brush away problems and sort of deny and diffuse them rather than face them head on. And I think that's what's happened in the case of Islamophobia now for many, many years, if I'm honest.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen Jones, sociologist at the University of Birmingham, UK.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.